Creative practices are almost always nonlinear. For the South African artist Manyaku Mashilo, her early background in fashion design deeply informs her artistic practice today. From themes of womanhood to spirituality, she explores material and memory through a variety of artistic interventions, grounded in a spiritual practice she's developed over many years.
Hi, I am Manyaku Mashilo. I am a visual artist. My practice is in painting, but mixed media as well. I sometimes dabble in some collage. I use some different elements in my work. Sometimes I use some clay, sometimes I use ink, oil, acrylic, and I like to think of myself as a storyteller. It's gone from oral to now visual and using my hands to tell stories. So yeah, that's what I do. I don't know whether artist or storyteller or visual artist is the is the appropriate term, but I'll take all of them.
I love this question because I think it gives folks an opportunity to describe themselves in their own way and really say, look, this is how I identify. This is how I want the world to see me and to know me. And I think for artists, there's always these ideas around what is the creative output? What are you sharing with the world? And how do you want people to sort of see you when you're thinking about that, right?
Absolutely.
So I'll jump in straight away with the first question. I know that one of the little more or less known facts about your practice and about your artistic practice is that you have a lot of your background comes from drawing and drawing as the foundation of your work, even though now you work in painting. And as you spoke earlier, you're working with different materials and different mediums, and you're now a visual storyteller. But can you speak a little bit about how drawing as the foundation of your practice has sort of got you where you are today?
So my background is actually in fashion design. And when I got to fashion school, I expected to be working with textiles and sewing and all of these things. But the college that I was in had this bridge between visual arts and then all the other subjects like graphic design and interior design and fashion design. And so we would meet at some of these subjects like art history and drawing and intermediate drawing and things like that. And I just gravitated more towards those subjects. I remember we were doing design was one of my favorites. It was where we got to basically be as inventive as possible. We'd get a theme and there we'd have to do certain exercises like mimic certain textures, but only using pencil crayons or only using pencil. And so for me, that bridge between textures, fabric textures, cloth textures, or the kind of fabric that we'd use to make the clothes, and then trying to realize that within a drawing form was something that I really enjoyed and loved. And so illustration became something that I spent a lot of time in or doing. And so I think that's where it began, if I trace it back. And after that, there was just something very meditative about trying to emulate or mimic textures, but using a pencil or using drawing. And the more I did that, I found that I could create all sorts of worlds in there. And so for me, drawing became that. I started then doing like portraiture of friends because I just wanted to be friends with certain people that I hadn't known yet, just to sort of bring the community of people that I admired closer to me. I started drawing portraits of like some maybe like musicians or people who I thought were like amazing. But then I tried to realize them within my own way, try to bring like different narratives around them, imagine what they would have looked like maybe if, for example, colonialism didn't take its effect and we were still incorporating our traditional way into like our modern way. And so I would sort of like bring in these visuals into an existing visual and create a whole new world with that. And I think drawing helped me a lot with that. I could do something very realistic, but I could also do something very abstract. And I think that's where the drawing sort of like started to build from. And then eventually, as I was exploring the sort of abstract backgrounds, a friend of mine suggested that I try painting. And there, the medium is a lot more fluid. And I really wanted to create a kind of movement in my work, then that's when I gravitate to painting. But the drawing is still there. I think now it exists more in a kind of mark making way, that where I again am creating these textures that I think I grew up with, or I'm just like reminiscent of.
Yes. And would you say that that correlation or that connection that you just drew between drawing and wanting to create this feeling and elicit textures through your drawing, do you find that that's something that still comes out today in your painting?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I don't know if you know this, but I'm also a tattoo artist.
I had no idea. That's dope. I'm looking for a new tattoo.
A few crazy people were like, "Hey, if you want to practice on me, you can." And I really loved, I mean, these sort of rites of passage ceremonies where it's not only the clothing, but it's also this sort of like mark making that happens on skin, like scarification, and even just like some of the patterns that I grew up seeing, like my grandmother draw on our bodies for like different ceremonies and things. And growing up in a religious Christian home, tattoos and mark making and these kind of things were also not allowed. And so, and I love the texture, especially on skin. And so with the tattooing as well, I think it started when I started mark making the figures in my work. And I thought about how could this look on bodies as well. And so the person sometimes that I'm drawing in the portrait ends up having some of the line work on their body, and really like bringing together that as well. So I think texture is really important to me. I'm like inked up everywhere, but I also try to like create these kind of textures on my body as well. I think textures are very important to me. They can tell a lot about like where you're from, which tribe you're from, where you've been. And yeah, textures are really important to me. I think they will always be in my work. And I'm just always trying to figure out ways where I can include them and discover new textures as well. I think the earth and the world is made up of just textures. And so for me, it's just a response. I think textures hold a lot of memory as well. You could like brush your hand against something and that could trigger a memory. You could see a certain thing, you could wear a certain thing and that can trigger a certain memory. So textures are something that I think I've come to learn are something that guide me a little bit, not just in my practice, but in as a marker of certain feelings, emotions, memories, those kind of things.
No, I think your answer brings up something that I really want to touch on because it's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about some of the themes that you explore in your work. The idea of Black womanhood, spirituality, ancestral memory, the idea of intimate emotional worlds that you're building through a visual language. How would you maybe talk a little bit more about that and maybe share some of the themes that you are investigating in your practice?
Mhm. I think the more my practice grows, the more inward I go. And the more inward I go, the more I realize that this practice or the work that I do is really just me trying to remember my mothers, trying to remember my grandmother, trying to remember the place which, for me, she was like a magician. My one grandmother was a farmer in rural Limpopo, and the kind of things that she built and made, and just watching her work as a child, to me, she was very magical. And my grandmother on my mother's side was also a spiritual healer, but someone who also worked a lot with like children and herbs and all these different textures. My practice, I've also come to realize, is not just about honoring my mothers, but it keeps trying to relive or make real right now, that feeling that I had when I grew up, when I was with my mothers and just exploring the things that they were exploring, whether it was within their spiritual healing or within their motherhood or within their womanhood, all the ways that they approach those kind of things taught me so much about myself. And it's places where I'm constantly having to go back to and access as a way to, I think, survive this, not just survive, but to feel like grounded. I remember my therapist asked me, what do you do to feel grounded? And I was like, there's a batch of photos of my grandmothers and how we grew up that I sometimes just flick through, and it just brings me back to, it reminds me all the ways that I can go and reground myself. It reminds me about all their practices and all the ways that they like all the knowledge systems that I can and have the ability to sort of like re-access through just like their memory to then heal and ground myself. And I think my practice before, I was like, I just really enjoy painting, I really enjoy drawing, but I really think what it is I'm just trying to like access them again. I'm trying to make real those experiences, or even just like make them true to myself again, because sometimes it feels like such a long time when you're a child in your formative years and you're seeing certain things, and when you grow up you're like, you forget, and there's so many things in this world that make you and force you to forget. But I think their life that they lived in the world has had a huge, incredible impact on how I approach my practice now, and even just how I approach my own womanhood, how I approach my own spirituality. I think because of them, my practice now is my spiritual practice, in the same way that my grandmother spiritual practice was working with people, in the same way that my grandmother, her spiritual practices was the plants and the herbs and the things that she grew to heal community. I think that's how I link these lineages, is back to my mothers and the kind of knowledge systems that they've had to create and invent in order to give us a better life, or just in order to like be here, to be grounded in this world that often rejects them. Yeah.
I think the one thing that's coming up for me about what you've shared is the idea that you can find yourself and you can find things that are going to help you on your journey by looking back, by looking at old photos, by looking at images, or maybe recalling memories from the past that help you to be grounded very much in the present. And as you were describing more about your practice and more about some of the themes that are present in your work, I was thinking about the idea of the young Manyaku, the student who's in school, who's discovering herself or discovering themselves and learning about who they are, who they want to be. And would you say that during and while in school and maybe in this process of becoming an artist, were you tapping into, like, were you discovering more about your family and your background and these themes that are present in your work now through creating a visual practice? The question is sort of like, when did you start to realize what you were sort of doing as an artist?
Yeah, I think in school, because I moved from like rural Limpopo to then the city of Pretoria, which is predominantly like white Afrikaans, not predominantly, but in the area that we had moved to. I was then put in like an Afrikaans school and all of these things. And I remember often having to fight for my, like, when, for example, when we went to, it's actually, I was just telling the story yesterday because it's Easter now, but during Easter, we would have a very specific experience going back home to rural Limpopo, the kind of church that we were in and the kind of practices that we were in. And when you come back to school, everyone's like, oh, how was your Easter? And you talk about, oh, we had all these like ceremonies and rituals, and it was on a mountain and all of this. And everyone's like, you're lying. No, that sounds like witchcraft or whatever. And so I learned to really like suppress a part of myself that belonged to like the people that raised me, that belonged to like my grandmothers, and really try to navigate like this new city world where everything sort of like made sense. And I think the older I got, or even just being in certain environments, being, for example, accessing like communities where jazz was present, or going to even the fashion school and going to like art class or whatever, I realized that there was something that needed to be told, needed to come forward, needed to have a place, something that had been like suppressed in me for quite a long time, and that I wasn't necessarily ashamed of, but was always told that like it wasn't okay, or it wasn't, oh, it didn't belong, you know? So I think there's a sense of belonging that moving away from home, which is Limpopo, kind of, there was like a disruption, I feel, that really like haunted me as an adult. And I was very adamant on telling stories that could give that memory, that child self, a place of belonging. I always say sometimes when I'm making work, I'm so focused on making the story as real as possible, or really trying to like communicate the colors and the feeling of it to the viewer. And I'm always very paranoid about, are people actually going to like read this, because it feels like it only exists in my mind and maybe only in my memory. But the way that people have responded to my work has been so affirming. It has really said like, yes, I had the same experience too, and that has been really powerful in finding people who are like, those colors remind me of this. And even people who aren't necessarily from South Africa, and then understanding that like my experience as a child is connected to so many other people, and that we're all just trying to find a sense of belonging within the different careers that we're in, whether it's art or whether it's fashion or whether it's writing. But we're all trying to basically create a space where like these stories, then they don't become real, but they are validated as like ours, and that they belong, you know? And so I think
The question was, and I ask my questions in a roundabout way, but it was really thinking about how and when you began to draw this connection between your past and
yes,
your visual practice in the present.
I think there's not one linear time. I think it has been progressively happening. And I think whether I wanted it to happen or not, it was always going to happen because of maybe the kind of mothers that I had. I think, yeah, I think it progressively happened over time. I think now I'm able to talk about it. I'm able to say what it is. I'm able to like give it words, give it its voice, and be like, oh, this is what it is. But it took me a while to realize why I was making work. But yeah, I think it happened over time, and I think it's still happening, and I think it'll continue to happen. I think there are many, many different things that I will keep uncovering and realizing about the kind of artist that I want to be. Maybe it might be that I'm just working my way to like being a healer, or being I it's difficult sometimes when people say, what do you do? Because you're like, I practice, I'm trying to tell this thing, I'm trying to tell stories in this way. I'm trying to do a specific thing that doesn't feel like it has one singular description, or it doesn't feel like I will ever fully land in it. But the practice of it brings me a little, like helps me uncover a little bit more of it, and in turn that like heals me in a way. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
I completely understand what you mean. And I think one of the things that it brings up for me, I mean, firstly, the fact that you used the term belonging and you spoke about it again and again makes me think about a conversation that I recently had with someone that I've worked with before. And we've talked at different times about my work, about my podcast, about my writing, about the different projects that I've done and sort of what it is that I'm building. And one of the things that we settled on is that so much of your work is about creating space for artists to tell their stories. And so much of your writing practice is about sharing stories that are not being told in the way that you want to see them, right? And in the way that you think are very generative. And that goes back to the sense of belonging, that you are here, you're present in the world, and your existence means that you have a right to be here. You don't have to prove that to anyone. Unfortunately, we live in a society that makes you think that, But that's not the reality. You're born into and of this world, and therefore it is your birthright to have everything that's here. And so I guess the question for me is, how does art and how does maybe the practice that you've been building in your life, both visually and otherwise, give you a sense of belonging?
Mm. My sense of belonging comes from community, and what being an artist and making this kind of work has done has really connected me to different kind of communities, but same kind of communities that I didn't know that I belonged to otherwise. And I think what's been like a very pleasant surprise is coming to the UK and finding so much community there who completely connect, understand, and are like, for me, that is the magic of like what this practice has done for me. It's really like, it's created proximity with the kind of community and the kind of knowledge that we should be sharing and the way that we're able to hold one another with our practices. And I think for me, that's given me a sense of belonging in so many different ways, not just in the way that it's supposed to be, but in a way that I can also redefine for myself, in a way that I can also introduce my children to. Sometimes when you have to move to several different places for like as a child, for work, for your parents, for their work and whatever, you build community and then you lose it, and then you build community and then you lose it. And my father moved around a lot for work, and eventually where he settled, we were living quite far away from the bigger community of like people and very isolated. And I think because of the kind of trauma that he went through, he was just like, I just want to be like isolated. And so a lot of the time was spending in the house just really wishing for a kind of like community and that feeling that like I belong to a kind of community. So I think even within the tattooing, that has like created a new kind of community where the majority of people who have my tattoos are like queer Black women. And they've taught me so much in the sessions that we've had, in the way that like we've become community, the way people recognize the mark making on each other and now they're friends or because of that and things like that. So I'm like, there's a belonging is really powerful, and it's something you can create for yourself. You know, if you don't have it or if you feel like you don't belong there, it's hard, but I think it's really important for me to, because yeah, there's many ways that I've been like rejected from my own communities, like the ones that I should be like from or should have held me, you know. Being like a queer Black woman, there's many ways that like your own community can be like, but then there's many ways that they can also pull you closer because of a certain thing. So I think, yeah, I think my practice has helped me belong to the places that I want to belong. I think it has become a big tool for that for sure.
I love that you mentioned that it's hard because I think it really drives home the point that sometimes finding community and finding yourself can be challenging. It can take a lot of time. You can go through a lot of different experiences. You can be rejected by some, embraced by others. And you can also have moments where maybe you feel like you're a part of something, but then as you step back, you're like, maybe this isn't the thing I want to be a part of. And so maybe I now have to do this work again and again. And I think that's a process that of finding yourself and finding yourself in relation to the world. Because on the one side, there's all of the internal stuff that happens. Who am I on the inside? On the other side, there's who am I in relation to other people? What am I bringing to the world that I'm in? And how am I contributing? And I think what's so beautiful is to think about how this conversation really started by speaking about your art practice. But what we're talking about now is life, right? And how much that is informed by art and how much there's an exchange happening, right? The artist is informed by the art is informed by the artist. Like those things are just happening on their own.
Intertwined always. Yeah, no, they're always intertwined.
Definitely. So as we round out the episode, just one final question. There's so many things that I could ask you, so I'll just try to sum it all up. But here's one. If If there were no words describing your work, but you just wanted to give people a feeling. So let's say you have an audience standing in front of your work and they don't have the opportunity to read anything. They're only there having a visceral reaction to something that's visual that they see. Are there things that you hope or want your work to elicit for people? Are there things that you want the work to do? Or do you not even think about it in that way?
Mhm. I think the way that I approach my work is through texture and color, which for me evokes so many different emotions. So as I'm working through the textures, working through the movements, selecting colors, for me, that's a very emotional thing that's happening while I'm making the work. I want that first and foremost to sit with like the viewer. I think also I work on a really big scale. So part of me wants the viewer to almost feel like they're in a room with the figures, or that they could step in and follow the figures or sit with them and contemplate with them. The sort of like gestures and form and the way that the figures sit in the work as well is it the figures are either holding and standing with you, or they're walking away and like leaving and almost inviting you to join the procession. So I think I want the viewer to feel a part of it, but there's certain things I'm doing that, like selecting color, like using certain textures, that invite you to connect back a certain feeling of like maybe the soil, or like certain textures and colors that you recognize that I know hit on something, even though for me they're a very specific reason. I want to do it on a big scale so that it like pulls that feeling. I remember finally seeing like a Mark Rothko painting, and it was just a really big one. I think it was at the Tate. And as you approach it, you feel like it's literally like swallowing you. And I think I work on a big scale as well with such vivid earth colors because I want you to feel like a part of that landscape. I want you to feel like that. I also want it to feel like I want you to start hearing music and having flashbacks in a way, which is why I also kind of sometimes go back to like the archive of South African Black photojournalism to include in the work, because as your body and your mind sees that work, I want you to have a different reaction. Maybe the reaction is not, oh, this is a violent picture of another Black person, but like maybe it's like it's changing the context and then making you feel different things about a popular image that maybe you may know. So I think there are ways that I try to have conversation with you. Like I want you to talk to the painting as much as I'm talking to it when I'm making it. And I'm always interested and very excited to be at the booth or at the exhibition when the paintings are up and have conversations with people, because from my experience, it something lands with the viewer, or the way that they respond to color a lot of the times, the way they respond to texture a lot of the time, and the way they just respond to seeing like someone who looks like them in the picture is something that's happened. So I think it's not like a linear response that I'm looking for. I don't even think you need to find my work good or you need to agree with it. But I think just pulling lots of different questions and conversations from the kind of textures and the kind of colors that I use will bring you back to a place that I think I depart from when I'm making the work. Yeah.
I love that. No, I completely understand what you mean. And I think to see your work and to hear you describe it, all of that hits home. It's just right down to the point, because the colors, the things that feel so reminiscent of something that's very familiar. And maybe there's a part of me that feels that way because I'm half African, I'm African American. Maybe there's parts of me that feel very much connected to your work because of that shared sort of background. But I also wonder if there's something really beautifully universal about the work as well, that it allows you to enter because, and I've been thinking about these ideas of how art draws you in, how it pulls on memories, and we talked about this earlier, but how it pulls on things that are familiar to you that you may not even realize. But as you see the work, things begin to unfold. As you spend more time with something, layers get peeled back. And that's just one of the many things that's so beautiful about art.
Yeah, absolutely. The layers, I work in several layers, and I think the closer or the more time you spend with it, you find things. Like I love for the work to have like these little hidden marks and avenues that you wouldn't necessarily see in a like on an Instagram post or on a picture on the internet, but experiencing in real time, you see the many layers that go into the work, and each one of them, I think, pull something. Yeah.
Absolutely. This was such a great episode. Manyaku Mashilo, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected.
Thank you, Shade. This is so lovely.
I'm glad we did this.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider supporting our work by becoming a subscriber. When you subscribe to Lightwork, you support the work of contemporary artists and the insightful and impactful conversations that I have with them as we investigate art, culture, and society. You support a female founder and a Black entrepreneurship at a time when our government and private corporations continue to eradicate DEI efforts. Subscribe to our Substack and you'll receive exclusive information and resources about each episode, behind the scenes content, and more. And remember, follow Lightwork across social platforms for more insights into the inner world of contemporary artists and thought leaders shaping culture.